society stands at the crossroads. Either transition to socialism or regression into barbarism. It is January 1919. Berlin is a war zone. The German Revolution is dying in the freezing streets, crushed under the boots of right-wing paramilitaries. The dream of a new world is ending in blood. Then, in the darkness of the Tiergarten Park, a soldier presses a pistol to the temple of a woman with graying hair. A single shot rings out. They drag her body to the railing and throw it into the icy Landwehr Canal. They believe they have finally silenced the most dangerous woman in Europe. But they are wrong. They killed the woman, but they could not kill the idea. By trying to erase her, they instead cemented her legacy as one of the most brilliant and consequential intellectuals of the 20th century. Tonight, we unravel the life of Rosa Luxemburg. She was a woman who predicted the rise of fascism and the tyranny of Stalinism long before they happened. She battled the Kaiser's generals, the police state, and even the leaders of her own movement. She offered a vision of the world that was neither capitalist exploitation nor authoritarian control, a third path that was silenced by her murder. But how did a Jewish girl from Poland become the intellectual giant who challenged Lenin himself? And why does her warning that we face socialism or barbarism feel more urgent today than ever before? Before we begin, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps us fight against algorithmic censorship. And let us know in the comments which topics you'd like us to explore next. Now, settle in as we travel from the borderlands of the Tsar's empire to the violent heart of Berlin, tracing the path of the woman who refused to stay silent while the world marched toward the abyss. This is the bedtime biography of Rosa Luxemburg. Chapter 1. The Girl from Zamość. The year is 1871. In the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the Prussian King Wilhelm I is being crowned German Emperor, and a new power is rising in the heart of Europe. In Paris, the Commune has just been drowned in blood, its barricades torn down, its dreamers shot against the walls of Père Lachaise cemetery. Karl Marx calls it the first dictatorship of the proletariat. The newspapers call it chaos, and in a small Renaissance town in Russian-occupied Poland, a baby girl is born who will one day be called the most dangerous woman in Europe. Her name, for now, is Rosa Luxemburg. She arrives on the 5th of March in the town of Zamość, a place that looks like it belongs in Italy rather than the flatlands of Congress Poland. The town was designed in the 16th century by an Italian architect for a Polish nobleman who wanted his own private utopia. There are arcaded houses around the market square, elegant proportions everywhere you look. The locals call it the Padua of the North. It is beautiful, and it is under the thumb of the Russian Tsar. The Luxemburg family lives in a house on Garden Street, purchased years earlier by Rosa's grandfather Abraham. Abraham was a timber merchant with connections that stretched across borders, a man of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment. He believed in reason, in integration, in leaving behind the black coats and side curls of the Hasidic Jews who dominated the region. His son, Edward, Rosa's father, inherited the business and the outlook. Edward traveled to Germany for trade, managed commerce between Warsaw and Zamość, and moved through the world like a man who belonged in it. An inventory list from the year of Rosa's birth tells us something about how the family lived. 7 tables, 24 chairs, 12 beds and sofas. Gold-framed mirrors and 8 oil paintings on the walls. Among the possessions was a magnificent double-breasted coat of the kind worn by Polish nobility, valued at 10 rubles. Edward had ambitions. He wanted to be seen as a Pole, not merely as a Jew tolerated in Polish lands. And yet the inventory also lists 2 Torah scrolls, the most expensive items in the house, at 26 rubles. The family kept 1 foot in each world. Sorry for the interruption. This is Charles from History After Dark, a channel that is entirely viewer-funded. I cannot produce these deep-dive documentaries without your direct support. A pledge of just a few dollars a month via Patreon or as a YouTube member provides the material base that keeps this channel alive. In return for your solidarity, you gain direct voting rights on future topics and a completely ad-free experience. Thank you. Rosa was the youngest of 5 children. By the time she was born, her older siblings were already teenagers or nearly adults. The household spoke Polish as its first language, but German and French and Russian floated through the rooms as well. Her mother Lena came from a family of rabbis and scholars, though Rosa would rarely mention this later in life. Lena loved Schiller and the German classics. She kept a warm house full of books. The family's connection to Polish patriotism was not abstract. During the January uprising of 1863, when Poles rose against Russian rule and were crushed, Edward had smuggled weapons from Sweden to Lithuania for the insurgents. This was not a family that merely talked about resistance. They had taken risks. They had chosen sides. When Rosa was 2.5 years old, the family left Zamość for Warsaw. The reasons were practical: better business opportunities for Edward, better schools for the children. They settled at number 16 Gold Street, close to the center of the city, but deliberately distant from the Jewish quarter, with its cramped streets and Yiddish-speaking masses. The Luxemburgs had left that world behind, at least in their own minds. In reality, it was only a few streets away. Warsaw in the 1870s was a city that belonged to Russia on paper and to Poland in its heart. Russian was the mandatory language of schools and government offices. Polish was forbidden in public life, but spoken in every home that dared. The family's apartment became a refuge where Adam Mickiewicz's poetry was read aloud, and the children learned to navigate the gap between what was permitted and what was true. Rosa grew up in a country that did not exist on any map. Poland had been carved up by its neighbors nearly a century earlier, divided between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. The nation survived only in memory, in language, in the stubborn refusal of families like hers to forget. She was Polish by culture, Jewish by heritage, and a subject of the Russian Tsar by the accident of geography. None of these identities fit together neatly. None of them ever would. The details of her earliest years are sparse. We know the house, the street, the inventory of furniture. We know her parents valued education and argued about politics and kept Torah scrolls alongside oil paintings. We know that revolutionary ferment was in the air and that the family had already proven it would act on its convictions. What we do not yet know is what Rosa herself would become. That story begins with a misdiagnosis, a year in bed, and a hip that never healed properly. Chapter 2. a broken hip, and a sharp mind. When Rosa was 5 years old, her hip began to cause her pain. The doctors examined her and came to a conclusion that would alter the course of her childhood. They diagnosed bone tuberculosis, a rare bacterial infection, and prescribed the standard treatment of the era. She was confined to bed for an entire year, her leg encased in a plaster cast, forbidden from walking or playing or doing much of anything at all. The diagnosis was wrong. She likely had hip dysplasia, a far more common condition, but the damage was done. When she finally emerged from that year of stillness, one leg had grown shorter than the other. She would walk with a limp for the rest of her life, concealing it as best she could beneath long dresses and careful, measured steps. But something else had happened during that year in bed. While other children ran through the streets of Zamość, Rosa had learned to read and write. She sent letters and poems to her family members in adjacent rooms of the house, demanding written replies. She was 6 years old and already claiming to be working for a children's newspaper. She began teaching the household servants to read. This tiny girl propped up on pillows, her leg in a cast, explaining the shapes of letters to grown men and women who had never learned them. The physical frailty forced her to develop something else entirely. If she could not command a room with her body, she would command it with her mind. The limp became something to overcome, to compensate for, and the compensation came in the form of an intellect that would eventually terrify the rulers of empires. In 1880, the family moved to Warsaw, and Rosa enrolled in the Second Warsaw Women's Gymnasium. It was a prestigious school, attended mostly by the daughters of Russian officials, and her attendance there spoke to her family's status. But the school was also a daily confrontation with the occupying power. The Russian authorities enforced strict policies of Russification. Speaking Polish was forbidden. Students were watched, reported on, made to feel that their own language was a crime. Rosa excelled anyway. She earned the highest possible mark in 14 subjects, a very good in 5 others. Languages came easily to her. History fascinated her. Her conduct record was listed as excellent. And yet, when graduation came in 1887, she was denied the gold medal that her grades had earned her. The reason given was her oppositional attitude toward the authorities. The attitude had been evident for years. At 13, she had written a satirical poem about a visit to Warsaw by Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany. She mocked the pomp of the occasion, referred to the Kaiser as the mighty one of the West, and announced her intention to stay away from such honorary demonstrations. She wanted to tell the Kaiser to keep his Chancellor Bismarck in check. She was 13. The world around her was teaching her other lessons too. From her window, she watched a man named Antony sweep the courtyard each morning. He loved newspapers, she noticed, but only for the shapes of the letters. He could not read them. Years later, writing from prison, she would remember that courtyard and the sacred silence of the early morning, and she would describe the feeling that had haunted her childhood, the sense that real life was somewhere far away, over the roofs, waiting to be found. In 1881, a pogrom erupted in Warsaw. A panic at a church turned into 3 days of looting and violence against Jews, while the Russian police watched and did nothing. Later, biographers would dramatize the event, imagining young Rosa hiding with her short leg from a howling mob. The truth was probably less cinematic, but the impact was real. She saw what happened when authorities pointed the rage of the masses toward convenient scapegoats. She saw how hatred could be manufactured, deployed, and then allowed to burn itself out while those in power looked the other way. It did not make her retreat into a narrow concern for her own people. Years later, she would write that the suffering of the Jews was no closer to her than the suffering of the Herero people in Africa or the victims of the rubber plantations. The lesson she took from Warsaw was not that Jews needed protection, but that all the suffering masses of the world were bound together, and that the systems producing such misery had to be dismantled everywhere at once. She was already writing poetry, translating Russian verse into Polish, channeling her sensitivity into words that demanded something be done. In one schoolgirl poem, she wrote that she wanted to burden the conscience of the sated with all suffering, all hidden bitter tears. It was the vow of a teenager, written in the margins of her notebooks while the Russian authorities confiscated Polish books and arrested students for speaking their mother tongue. But it was a vow she would keep. Denied her gold medal and marked as a rebel by the school authorities, Rosa did not retreat into the domestic life expected of a girl from her class. The real life she had dreamed of over the rooftops was calling. But in Warsaw, answering that call meant risking exile to Siberia. The police were already watching. The young graduate with the limp and the sharp tongue would have to find her future somewhere else, across a border, beyond the reach of the Tsar's agents. And getting there would require more than just a passport. Chapter 3. The Escape in the Hay. By 1888, Rosa was 17 years old and already in serious trouble. She had joined the Second Proletariat, an illegal socialist group that operated in the shadows of Russian-occupied Poland. The party's original leaders had been executed or sent to rot in Siberian camps, but the movement had reconstituted itself, quieter now, more careful, and Rosa was one of its most dedicated members. The proletariat was unusual among Polish radicals. Most underground groups dreamed of Polish independence, of throwing off the Russian yoke and restoring the old nation. Rosa's comrades wanted something else entirely. They believed that national borders were a distraction, that the real struggle was between the workers of all countries and the bosses who exploited them. Polish independence meant nothing if Polish workers were still poor. Rosa adopted this view completely, and it put her at odds with nearly every other revolutionary in Warsaw. Her work was dangerous and unglamorous. She attended secret reading circles called Koka, where workers and students gathered in cramped apartments to study Marxist theory by candlelight. The Tsarist police considered such gatherings treasonous. If caught, participants faced prison, exile, or worse. Rosa was good at this work. She could explain difficult economic concepts in plain language, and she had a way of making people feel that the struggle was worth the risk. The police noticed. By 1889, they had identified her as a rigorous agitator, and Rosa knew her time was running out. The prospect of deportation to Siberia hung over her like a blade. She had seen what happened to people who were sent east. Some died on the journey, others simply vanished into the frozen vastness and were never heard from again. She had obtained a passport the previous March, but using it at the border was impossible. Her name was on the watch lists. A comrade named Marcin Kasperzak organized her escape. Kasperzak was a printer by trade, a calm and practical man who would later be executed for his revolutionary activities in 1905. He knew the border region near the German province of Posen, and he devised a plan that sounded like something from an adventure novel. Rosa traveled to the border zone and waited. When difficulties arose at the crossing, Kasperzak improvised. He found a local Catholic priest and spun an elaborate story about a Jewish girl who desperately wanted to convert to Christianity but was being prevented by her strict family. The priest, moved by this tale of spiritual longing, agreed to help smuggle the girl across the border. He had no idea he was assisting a revolutionary atheist who wanted to overthrow the social order. Rosa was hidden in a peasant's cart and buried under a pile of straw and hay. The journey was physically agonizing, especially for a young woman with a damaged hip who had walked with a limp since childhood. She lay in the dark, breathing through the dusty straw, feeling every bump and jolt of the road, terrified that the border guards would decide to search the cart. They did not. She crossed into Germany and kept moving. She arrived in Zurich around February of 1889, registering with the Swiss authorities on the 18th of that month. Zurich was her destination because it was one of the few places in Europe where women could study at the university on equal terms with men. In Russia, in Germany, in most of the so-called civilized world, the doors of higher education remained closed to women. In Zurich, they stood open. She rented a small room at Nelkenstrasse 5, later moving to number 12 to live with the family of Karl Lübeck, a German social democrat who had fled his own country due to the anti-socialist laws. Lübeck was an old comrade of the legendary socialist leaders Bebel and Liebknecht, and Rosa helped him with his writing in exchange for room and board. The city was teeming with political exiles. Russians, Poles, Germans, Italians, revolutionaries of every stripe crowded the libraries and workers' clubs, debating world revolution late into the night over cheap coffee and cheaper wine. Rosa found the Polish reading room and a community of like-minded radicals who welcomed her as one of their own. She enrolled at the university, initially studying philosophy and zoology. The zoology reflected her lifelong fascination with the natural world, with birds and plants and the intricate workings of living things. But she soon switched to law and economics, subjects that would better arm her for the political struggle ahead. The university register noted her arrival, one more foreign student among hundreds, but she quickly gained a reputation as something more. Professors found themselves challenged by a small woman with a limp who asked questions they could not easily answer. The girl from the provinces had successfully smuggled herself onto the stage of world history. Behind her lay Poland, the police, the threat of Siberia. Ahead lay a new life among books and revolutionaries, a life she had risked everything to reach. She was free, she was safe, and she was ready to begin. Chapter 4. Love and Theory in Zurich. In the autumn of 1890, a new student appeared in the émigré circles. His name was Leo Yogikis. He was 4 years older than Rosa, from a wealthy Jewish family in Vilnius, and already something of a legend among the underground. He had dodged the Russian military draft, organized workers in secret, and used his family's money to fund revolutionary newspapers rather than a comfortable life. He was intense, brilliant, and almost impossible to get along with. They began as intellectual sparring partners. Within months, they were lovers. Rosa called him Giorgio in her letters. She called herself his wife. She dreamed aloud of a small apartment somewhere, a proper library, maybe even a child. Leo responded with critiques of her latest article and instructions for the next pamphlet. He was not a man built for warmth. But he recognized her gifts, perhaps more clearly than anyone else did. He was the one who pushed her to focus on economics. He saw what she could become. Together they waged war on the dominant Polish Socialist Party, the PPS, which wanted to restore Polish independence above all else. Rosa and Leo thought this was a distraction at best, a betrayal at worst. The working class, they argued, had no country. A Polish factory worker had more in common with a Russian factory worker than with a Polish landlord. The goal was international revolution, not new flags and new borders. To spread this message, they founded their own party in 1893, the Social Democracy of the Kingdom of Poland, and launched a newspaper called Sprawa Robotnicza, the Workers' Cause. Rosa edited it under a pseudonym. Leo paid for it out of his own pocket. They were two people against an entire nationalist movement, and they did not seem to care. That August, Rosa got her chance to make noise on a larger stage. The Socialist International held its Congress in Zurich in the Grand Tonhalle Concert Hall. Delegates came from every corner of Europe, the giants of the movement, men like August Bebel and Karl Kautsky. Rosa demanded that her tiny new party be given a seat. The PPS objected. A jurisdictional fight broke out. When her turn came to speak, she could barely be seen above the podium. The newspapers described her as frail, small. Someone found her a chair to stand on, and then she opened her mouth and the hall went quiet. She tore into the PPS for mixing socialism with nationalism. She called them social patriots, a phrase dripping with contempt. The established delegates watched this unknown 22-year-old with a limp lecture them on the future of the revolution, and they did not quite know what to make of it. She lost the vote on her mandate, technicalities, but it did not matter. Everyone who had been in that hall remembered her. A new voice had arrived. Her doctoral dissertation, finished a few years later, was titled The Industrial Development of Poland. It was dense with statistics, not the sort of thing most people would read for pleasure. But it was also a weapon. Rosa used the data to prove that the Polish economy was so thoroughly entangled with Russia's that independence made no practical sense. The dissertation earned her a magna cum laude and gave her arguments the weight of scholarship. The years in Zurich settled into a rhythm of constant work, editing, writing, smuggling pamphlets across the border into the Russian Empire. Rosa and Leo lived in a kind of self-imposed discipline, denying themselves the leisure that exile might have offered. The mountains were beautiful. The lake was beautiful. They barely noticed. And yet Zurich was too small. Rosa knew it. The real center of the socialist world was Berlin, where the German Social Democratic Party commanded millions of votes and seemed on the verge of reshaping history. If she wanted to matter, she had to be there. But as a Russian subject and a known radical, she would be deported the moment she tried to organize. She needed legal protection. She needed a German passport. And in 1898, there was only one reliable way for a woman to get one. Chapter 5. The Sham Marriage. By the spring of 1898, Rosa had made up her mind. Her future lay in Berlin, the beating heart of the German Social Democratic Party, the largest and most powerful socialist organization in the world. There was only one problem. As a Russian subject, She could be expelled from Prussia the moment she opened her mouth at a political meeting. The Prussian police were efficient and unforgiving. She needed German citizenship, and she needed it fast. The solution arrived in the form of Gustav Lübeck, the son of her old Zurich landlords. Gustav was not keen on the arrangement. He had to be talked into it by his mother, Olympia, who adored Rosa and saw the marriage as a small sacrifice for a great cause. On April 19, 1898, Rosa walked into the Basel registry office and signed her name as Rosalia Lübeck. She would technically hold that name for the rest of her life, though she never once used it in politics or in print. The ceremony was brief, purely administrative, almost comically devoid of sentiment. Immediately afterward, the newlyweds went their separate ways. They never shared a home, never shared a meal as husband and wife. On some official documents, Rosa even listed Leo Jogikis' Zurich address as her own residence, a quiet joke at the expense of the bureaucrats. On May 12th, Rosa boarded a train bound for Germany. She left Leo behind on the platform, or perhaps at his desk surrounded by pamphlets. It was a painful parting. Leo still had his doctorate to finish, though he never would. For the first time in years, their partnership would exist only on paper, conducted through the post, one anxious letter at a time. She arrived in Berlin on May 16th. The city was vast, grey, and indifferent. She spent her first days hunting for a room, trudging through neighborhoods that seemed to stretch on forever. She rejected Charlottenburg as too proletarian, too far from the center of things. Eventually she found a place near the Tiergarten, close enough to the party offices and the political salons where reputations were made. The loneliness hit her almost immediately. Berlin felt cold and foreign, a city of strangers hurrying past in heavy coats. She wrote to Leo daily, sometimes twice, pouring out her alienation. "I feel like a stranger here," she confessed. "I have a damn desire to be happy." It was a rare admission from a woman who usually armored herself in confidence. She wanted a private life, a nest of her own. Politics kept stealing it from her. But to the party leadership she showed a different face entirely. She marched into the office of Ignaz Auer, the veteran party secretary, and announced that she had come to help with the work. Auer, a cynic who had seen 100 eager young radicals come and go, looked her over and reportedly called her a clever poison noodle. It was not entirely a compliment, but it was not entirely an insult either. He recognized something sharp in her. She met August Bebel, the grand old man of German socialism, the so-called shadow emperor of the working class. Rosa respected him, but she was not intimidated. She found the party elders comfortable, almost bourgeois in their habits. They fussed over administrative details while the class struggle waited. It was a far cry from the underground movement in Poland, where every meeting carried the risk of arrest, where politics was a matter of life and death. She settled into a small room in Friedenau, surrounded by books and papers and the faint smell of ink. She wrote constantly, to Leo most of all, asking his advice on every move, every article, every tactical decision. Their symbiotic partnership continued across the miles, though it grew more strained with each exchange. Leo's letters were full of criticism, corrections, demands. He wrote like a schoolmaster, she complained, not like a lover. Money was tight. She survived on small payments for articles and occasional stipends from Leo, tracking every pennig spent on tram, fare, or milk. The economics of the professional revolutionary were unforgiving. To combat the isolation and to make her name, she threw herself into the Reichstag election campaign, offering her services as an agitator. The party leadership looked at this articulate, multilingual woman from the East and decided to send her to the toughest region they had, Upper Silesia, the coal country where miners lived hard and died young. In her spare hours, she walked in the Tiergarten. The trees and the birds grounded her. She watched the seasons shift across the park, finding a small peace among the grey tenements and the sterile party offices. It was a habit she would keep for the rest of her life. This period marked a transformation. Rosa was no longer an émigré student debating theory in Swiss cafes. She was becoming a German politician, learning to navigate the complex federal machinery of the SPD. And she was beginning to see that the real battle was not only against the Kaiser and his generals, it was for the soul of the party itself. Secure with her German passport, but lonely in her Berlin room, Rosa looked for a fight that would establish her authority. She did not have to look far. The party was in the grip of a quiet identity crisis. A senior figure named Eduard Bernstein had recently suggested that socialism could be achieved through gradual reform, that revolution was unnecessary, perhaps even undesirable. It was a comfortable, seductive idea, and many in the leadership secretly agreed. Rosa saw it as a death sentence for everything she believed in. While the old guard hesitated to attack an old friend, the young woman from Zamość reached for her pen. Chapter 6. Taking on the Titans. Rosa arrived in Berlin just as the ground was shifting beneath the largest socialist party in the world. Eduard Bernstein, a man who had been entrusted with Engels's own papers, had begun publishing a series of articles that amounted to heresy. Capitalism, he argued, was not collapsing. The great crisis Marx had predicted was not coming. The party should abandon its revolutionary dreams and settle for something more modest, more gradual, more respectable. His famous dictum cut to the bone: the movement is everything, the goal is nothing. To Rosa, this was not a tactical adjustment or a reasonable disagreement among comrades. It was surrender dressed up in philosophical language. It would turn the party into a glorified pressure group, begging for crumbs from the capitalist table rather than overturning it entirely. The party elders hesitated. Bebel and Kautsky had known Bernstein for decades. He was a friend, a colleague, a man who had suffered exile alongside them. They did not want to attack him publicly. Rosa felt no such loyalty. She saw an opening, and she took it. In September of 1898, she launched a counterattack in the pages of the Leipziger Volkszeitung that left little room for compromise. Her articles were later collected into a pamphlet called Social Reform or Revolution. The title alone announced a choice, a fork in the road. She dismantled Bernstein's arguments with the precision of a surgeon, arguing that without the ultimate goal of seizing power, the daily struggle for higher wages was nothing more than a labor of Sisyphus. You push the boulder up the hill. It rolls back down. You push it again. Forever. That same summer, the party sent her to Upper Silesia to campaign for the Reichstag elections. It was difficult territory, heavily Catholic, suspicious of outsiders, and the SPD had almost no presence there. But Rosa spoke fluent Polish alongside her German. She understood the miners and steelworkers in a way the Berlin intellectuals never could. The reports that came back used words like thunderous approval. She spoke to crowds of thousands, workers who had never heard a woman address them with such force, such obvious command of her subject. The Catholic clergy denounced her from the pulpit. The local authorities watched her every move. She seemed to feed on the hostility, turning each confrontation into a kind of performance that only drew more people to hear what all the fuss was about. In October, she returned to the party stage at the Stuttgart Congress. This was where she would face the titans in person. Georg von Vollmar, a leader of the reformist wing, looked at this young woman from Poland and saw someone who needed to be put in her place. He dismissed her as a young recruit who should learn from the veterans before presuming to lecture them. Rosa's response became the stuff of legend. Rank in the party, she declared, was not earned by age. It was earned by fighting the enemy. She would rather be right with the masses than wrong with the old veterans. The hall erupted. Her pamphlet spread through socialist circles across Europe. She argued that capitalism's crises were baked into the system itself, that the clever financial instruments Bernstein trusted would not stabilize anything, but would instead magnify the coming catastrophes. Credit and cartels were not solutions. They were accelerants. She did not limit her attacks to the obvious enemies on the right. The center of the party, led by Kautsky himself, came in for criticism too. They were too passive, she argued. They wrote about revolution in their journals and then waited for it to arrive like a train running on schedule. The party needed to actively prepare the working class, not just theorize about historical inevitability. Through all of this, she kept writing to Leo back in Zurich. Her letters mixed political analysis with exasperation at his constant critiques of her work. Dummkopf, she called him. Fool. Her professional confidence was catching up to her intellectual abilities. At a meeting in Hamburg, she addressed 2,000 people. The police officer assigned to monitor her filed a report noting her fascinating nature and incendiary eloquence. He seemed almost impressed, despite himself. She could carry the masses away, he wrote, as if describing a force of nature rather than a woman who stood on chairs to be seen above the crowd. The revisionist controversy ended, officially with a victory for the orthodox Marxists. Bernstein's position was formally condemned, but Rosa understood that the spirit of reformism had not been defeated. It lived on in the daily practices of the trade union bureaucrats and the parliamentary tacticians who had grown comfortable with their positions, their salaries, their respectability. By 1899, the penniless girl who had arrived in Berlin just a year earlier had become a recognized leader of the party's left wing. The revisionists feared her. The leadership respected her, even when they wished she would soften her tone. She had proven that a woman, a Jew, a foreigner with a limp could stand at the center of the German working class movement and hold her ground against anyone. Her aggressive style polarized the party in ways that would never fully heal. The rank and file adored her. The functionaries viewed her with suspicion, this woman who seemed incapable of compromise, who treated every disagreement as a matter of principle rather than politics. It was a dynamic that would define her entire career. She had won the intellectual battle. But the party machinery was already calcifying into something cautious and bureaucratic, more interested in preserving what it had built than in risking everything for what it claimed to believe. The conflict between Rosa's revolutionary ethics and the party's institutional inertia was just beginning. Chapter 7. The Happy Prisoner. Rosa's sharp tongue finally caught up with her in 1904. The charge was lèse-majesté, that wonderfully archaic crime of insulting the monarch. Her offense had been a speech delivered 3 years earlier in Breslau, where she had committed the unforgivable sin of stating the obvious. Kaiser Wilhelm II, she said, when he spoke of the secure existence of German workers, had no idea of the facts. The prosecutor initially saw no grounds for a case, but then the Saxon Ministry of Justice intervened and ordered an indictment anyway. On January 17th, she stood trial and received a sentence of 3 months. By late August, she was walking through the gates of the Zwickau District Court prison. What happened next surprised everyone, perhaps Rosa most of all. The imprisonment became something close to a holiday. After years of frantic agitation, of trains and meetings and speeches that blurred into one another, the cell offered her something she had almost forgotten existed: silence, time, the ability to finish a thought without someone interrupting with news of some fresh political crisis. She described her state in letters not as suffering, but as a kind of curious study. She had examined the inner life of the penal institution so thoroughly, she joked that she couldn't possibly attend meetings. The regime was mild enough. Her brother Maximilian sent money so she could order food from a restaurant rather than choke down prison slop, which mattered enormously given her chronic stomach troubles. Her other brother, Joseph, a doctor, came to visit and brought news from the family back in Poland. To Leo Yogikis she sent instructions, endless instructions, updates on party matters, queries about her publications, tactical suggestions for battles she could not fight from behind bars. Never a word about personal needs, never any warmth. The coldness between them had calcified into something functional and joyless. But to Louise Kautsky she wrote differently. Luigina, she called her, Liebste. The letters overflowed with intimacy, with a kind of unguarded feeling she no longer seemed capable of directing toward Leo. Her emotional anchor had shifted somewhere along the way, drifting from the brooding Lithuanian revolutionary to the warm circle of friends she had built in Berlin. In one letter to Louise, Rosa found herself traveling backward through memory. She wrote about Antony, the sweeper from her childhood courtyard, and the sacred silence of those mornings. She remembered that old feeling that real life was somewhere far away, over the rooftops, in a place she could not yet reach. That longing had never left her. It had driven her out of Poland through the universities of Zurich into the debating halls of Berlin. And now, here she sat in a cell in Zwickau, still feeling that life played a game of eternal tag with her, always seeming to be somewhere she was not. The sentence was supposed to last 3 months. It ended after 2. A general amnesty had been declared to celebrate the accession of King Friedrich August III of Saxony to the throne. Prisoners across the kingdom walked free. Rosa protested. She actually protested against being released. She would serve her time on her own terms, thank you very much, rather than accept the grace of a monarch she despised. The authorities, presumably baffled, let her go anyway. She walked out of Zwickau in October of 1904, mentally refreshed but restless in a way the quiet weeks had not cured. The world outside had been moving without her. The Russo-Japanese War had broken out back in February. The International Socialist Congress had met in Amsterdam in August, and the debates over mass strikes and revolutionary tactics had raged on without her sharp interventions from the floor. She threw herself back into work immediately. She took over a seat in the International Socialist Bureau, a signal of her rising status not just in Germany, but across the European movement. The Red Rosa was now a title earned in the Kaiser's dungeons, a badge she would wear into whatever battles lay ahead. But Berlin felt stagnant that autumn. The real news was arriving from the east, from the land of her birth. Tensions were building in the Russian Empire, workers were organizing, the air smelled like something was about to break. Then, in January of 1905, Tsarist troops opened fire on peaceful demonstrators in St. Petersburg. The shockwave rippled outward across the continent. Rosa watched from Berlin, feverishly writing articles, but ink and paper no longer felt like enough. The history she had studied and theorized about for years was finally happening, and she could not remain a spectator. She would have to go into the fire herself. Chapter 8. Into the Fire. The news arrived in Berlin like a thunderclap. On the 22nd of January, 1905, soldiers of Tsar Nicholas had opened fire on a peaceful procession of workers in St. Petersburg. Father Gapon had led them to the Winter Palace, carrying icons and portraits of the Tsar, hoping to present a petition. The troops answered with bullets. Hundreds fell dead in the snow. Thousands more were wounded. Rosa read the reports and understood immediately what she was witnessing. This was no riot. This was revolution. The civil war of freedom, she declared, had begun. And for the next 12 months, she could barely sit still. From her desk in Friedenau, she wrote with furious intensity, producing over 80 texts on the Russian upheaval alone. She called it the active entry of the proletarian fist into history, but writing felt hollow. The revolution was spreading to Poland. Mass strikes had erupted in Warsaw and Łódź. Her homeland was on fire, and she was watching from 1,000 kilometers away. By December, she could bear it no longer. The party leadership warned her that traveling to Russian-controlled Poland was suicidal. She went anyway. Due to a railway strike, the final leg of her journey had to be made aboard a military train packed with soldiers. She was the only civilian passenger. She sat on her suitcase in an unheated, unlit carriage, invisible in the dark, rattling toward Warsaw. She arrived in late December under the name Anna Matschke, a German journalist. She checked into a pension on Ulrika Jasna, run by a Countess Walewska. In a stunning breach of every rule of underground work, Leo Yogicus was staying at the same address, calling himself Otto Engelmann. They kept separate rooms but worked side by side, day after day, in the beating heart of the uprising. Warsaw hummed with tension and possibility. Police patrols moved through the streets, hunting for the secret presses that printed the party newspaper. They never found them. Meanwhile, newsboys sold copies of the Red Banner openly for 10 kopecks. Rosa wrote that the police were breaking their skulls trying to locate the source, while the party forced bourgeois printers to run the machines with revolvers in hand. She spent 2 months like this, writing, organizing, feeling what she called the pulse of history beneath her fingers. Later, she would describe it as the happiest time of her life. It ended on the 4th of March, 1906. Police raided the pension after a tip-off, possibly from a reactionary German newspaper. They arrested Anna Matschke and Otto Engelmann. Rosa was taken first to the town hall prison, where she was crammed into a single cell with 14 other women. Some were political prisoners. Others were common criminals or mentally ill. The smell was unbearable. She wrote to the Kautskys with grim humor, signing the letter as "Your Anna," noting that her cell was a jewel compared to others where 60 people were packed together. Her cover didn't hold. Once the authorities realized who they had, everything changed. She was transferred to Paryak prison, and then, on the 11th of April, to Pavilion X of the Warsaw Citadel. The Citadel was a place where people disappeared. Executions were carried out in the courtyard. Rosa could hear the firing squads. She could hear the other prisoners singing the funeral march as their comrades were led away. She faced a potential court-martial. The charge was involvement in the party's fighting organization, which aimed to overthrow the monarchy. The penalty was death. Her health collapsed. Anemia, stomach problems, the psychological weight of watching friends taken out to be hanged or shipped to Siberia. Meanwhile, a frantic rescue operation was underway. August Bebel, the grand old man of German socialism, sent word to spare no expense. Rosa's brother Stanisław raised 3,000 rubles for bail, money that would be forfeited when she fled. Bribes almost certainly changed hands. A medical report declared her unfit for further detention due to heart and liver complications. On the 28th of June, the prison doors opened. She was released on the condition that she remain in Warsaw for trial. She had no intention of staying. Within days, she slipped out of the city, made her way to St. Petersburg, and crossed into Finland. In Kuokala, she spent a month recovering in a rented dacha, meeting frequently with Lenin and other Bolshevik leaders who were also hiding there. They argued about theory and tactics, but a mutual respect formed despite their differences. Leo was not so fortunate. He remained in the citadel and was sentenced to 8 years of hard labor in Siberia. He would escape in 1907, but that is another story. Rosa had slipped the hangman's noose, but she did not return to Germany to rest. She returned with something new burning in her mind. She had witnessed the raw, ungovernable power of the masses, a force that didn't wait for permission, that overwhelmed the careful plans of party bureaucrats. She brought back a weapon she believed could transform the future of socialism. She called it the mass strike. And she was about to discover that preaching this gospel to the cautious, well-organized trade unions of Germany would prove more dangerous in its own way than anything she had faced in Warsaw. Chapter 9. The Mass Strike. Rosa returned to Germany in September of 1906, carrying the lessons of the Russian streets like something burning in her pocket. She arrived just in time for the party congress in Mannheim, where she fully intended to light a fire under the German working class. What she found instead was a wall of men in respectable suits who wanted nothing more than for her to sit down and be quiet. The trade union leaders were terrified. They had spent decades building their organizations brick by careful brick, accumulating members, dues, meeting halls, pension funds. The revolution Rosa had witnessed in Warsaw looked to them like a hurricane that would tear it all down. They wanted calm. They wanted growth. They wanted to know that next year would look like this year, only slightly better. At the Congress, Rosa confronted Theodor Boemelberg, the trade union boss who had declared that the labor movement needed peace and quiet to flourish. She mocked him openly. Were they living in the year of the glorious Russian Revolution, she demanded, or had they somehow slipped back a decade? The delegates shifted in their seats. Some laughed nervously. The union men stared straight ahead. The Congress ended in what the newspapers called a compromise, the Mannheim Agreement. In practice, it was a defeat. The agreement gave the trade unions veto power over any mass strike action. Before the party could call the workers into the streets, the union bosses would have to agree. And the union bosses, Rosa understood, would never agree to anything that might risk their carefully constructed empire of membership cards and benefit schemes. That summer, before the Congress, she had been staying in Kuokala, Finland, where the pine trees grew thick and the Russian police could not easily follow. There she had written a pamphlet that would become one of her most important works, The Mass Strike, the Political Party, and the Trade Unions. In it, she laid out what she had learned in Warsaw. The mass strike was not a weapon that leaders could pick up and deploy like artillery. It was something else entirely. It rose from below, from the workers themselves, unpredictable and alive. She argued that you could not separate the economic struggle from the political one. A strike for higher wages might transform overnight into a rebellion against the state. A political demonstration might trigger a wave of factory walkouts that spread from city to city like fever. This was not chaos to be feared. This was the living pulse of class struggle. Her ideas put her at odds with nearly everyone. The revisionists thought she was reckless. But increasingly, so did her old friend and mentor Karl Kautsky, the man they called the Pope of Marxism. Kautsky preferred patience, organization, careful accumulation of strength until the moment was exactly right. Rosa thought this was another way of saying the moment would never be right. The rift between them cracked open in 1910. During the fight for voting reform in Prussia, hundreds of thousands of workers flooded the streets demanding change. Rosa saw the mass strike she had written about becoming real before her eyes. But the party leadership, Kautsky among them, urged caution. They did not want to risk their position in the upcoming elections. They tried to dampen the energy in the streets rather than feed it. Rosa wrote an article called What Next?, demanding the party take the next logical step and call a mass strike. The party newspaper refused to print it. She sent it to Kautsky for his theoretical journal. He refused too. Unless she removed her call for a republic, she would not. The friendship, such as it had been, was over. She published the article in provincial papers instead, smaller outlets beyond the reach of Berlin's editorial caution. Kautsky responded with elaborate theoretical justifications for waiting. He called it the strategy of exhaustion, wearing down the enemy over time rather than risking a decisive confrontation. Rosa called it nothing but parliamentarianism. She did not mean it as a compliment. The party hierarchy grew tired of her. August Bebel, the grand old man of German socialism, respected her intellect but wished she would stop stirring up trouble. The union leaders hated her openly. None of this stopped her from touring the country, speaking to packed halls where workers hung on her words. They called it her ignition eloquence, this ability to set a crowd alight. The party apparatus might marginalize her in the newspapers and the committees, but they could not stop people from showing up to hear her speak. What she saw in the party appalled her. It was becoming an end in itself, a bureaucratic machine more concerned with its own survival than with the revolution it claimed to serve. The leaders wanted to decide on mass strikes in whispers behind closed doors. Rosa believed the command could only come from the workers themselves, from below, from the streets. By the end of 1910, she was politically homeless within her own party. Her friendship with the Kautskys survived only through his wife Louise, who continued to write. But the intellectual bond with Karl was severed completely. Rosa found herself arguing for revolution inside an organization that increasingly wanted only to win the next election. And yet, she would not leave. She held to a simple maxim. The worst working-class party is better than none. You had to stay where the workers were, even if the leadership had lost its way, even if they called you a poison noodle, even if they refused to print your articles. You stayed, and you kept fighting, because that was what you did. Chapter 10. The Teacher and the Lover. On the 15th of November, 1906, the Social Democratic Party opened its new school in Berlin. The classrooms smelled of fresh paint and ambition, and among the instructors there was only one woman. Rosa had been brought in to teach national economy and economic history. She was filling in for someone else at first, but within months she had become what one observer called the spiritual head of the whole school. Her students were not young idealists fresh from university. They were trade union officials, party secretaries, men who had spent years on factory floors and knew the weight of a long shift. They came expecting lectures. What they got was something else entirely. She refused to stand behind a lectern. Instead, she walked among them, making eye contact, asking questions, waiting for answers. She loathed academic jargon, the kind of language that made simple ideas sound complicated, and complicated ideas sound impossible. One student, Rosie Wolfstein, remembered how Rosa could transform dry economic laws into living history. Another, Wilhelm Pieck, was so moved by her teaching that he relocated to Berlin just to work for the party's education committee. Decades later he would become president of East Germany, but in those years he was simply one of many who sat in her classroom and watched her pace the floor, turning Marx into something you could actually feel. But while she was publicly the discipline theorist, her private life had become a kind of slow-motion catastrophe. His name was Kostya Zetkin. He was the son of her closest friend, Clara. He was also 14 years younger than Rosa. The affair had begun in secret and stayed that way, hidden from the party, hidden from most of her friends. In her letters to him, she used nicknames that revealed a side of her few people ever saw. She called him New. She called him Dudu. She called him her sweet friend, her beautiful, slender boy. She craved intimacy, adoration, the kind of warmth she felt Leo Yogicus had always denied her. Leo did not take the separation well. He became, in Rosa's words, a raving, avenging angel. He stalked her. He refused to return her apartment keys. He threatened to kill her, to kill Kostya, to kill himself. At one point he bought a revolver. Rosa bought one too. She lived in fear of his surprise visits. Some nights she fled her own apartment and slept at the Kautskys' place, or at Hans Diefenbach's. In a letter from the spring of 1908, she described a scene that still has the power to unsettle. Leo had burst into her room. He told her she would drop dead on the spot if she travelled with Kautsky. Then He grabbed her hand and tore a ring from her finger. She wrote that she had remained icy calm on the outside. But inside, she said, the mistreatment left her so agitated she had to leave again, to go back to the Kautskys, to get away from him. By now, she was fighting on two fronts: the revisionists on the right, who wanted gradual reform, and the so-called Marxist center, who agreed with her in theory but flinched when it came time to act. Her circle of true allies had shrunk to a handful: Clara Zetkin, Franz Mehring, a few others. That was it. In August of 1911, she moved to a quiet suburb called Zudenda. The apartment had 5 rooms. Her cat Mimi came with her, along with her housekeeper Gertrude Zlotko. She wanted peace. She wanted distance from the noise of the city and the memories of Friedenau. She started painting, mostly flowers and plants, and begged Kostya not to laugh at her wretched attempts. She collected specimens for her herbarium with the precision of a scientist. The affair with Kostya eventually cooled. He was young. He wanted his own life. In a farewell letter, she wrote that she would not touch the private life that belonged to him alone. She told Mimi they were alone now. And then, in a frenzy of intellectual energy, she wrote a book. It took her 4 months. She called it The Accumulation of Capital, and she worked on it at her desk while Mimi watched from the red plush tablecloth. The argument was dense, but the conclusion was stark. Capitalism, she claimed, required non-capitalist markets to survive. It needed colonies. It needed expansion. And that meant imperialism and war were not accidents. They were built into the system itself. The party experts ignored it or dismissed it. She defended it anyway, calling it a contribution to the economic explanation of imperialism. She was used to being dismissed by now. By 1912, Rosa Luxemburg had become a figure of contradictions, the red spectre to the bourgeoisie, a clever poison noodle to her critics within the party, a beloved teacher to her students. She was isolated, heartbroken, and standing at the edge of a war she had spent years predicting. The abstract concepts she had analyzed in her books were about to become real cannons and real corpses, and she was determined to fight. Chapter 11. War on War. By 1913, the shadow of war had stretched itself across Europe like something patient and cold. The Balkan Wars had already drawn blood, and anyone paying attention could feel the larger catastrophe gathering at the edges. Rosa threw herself into the fight against it with everything she had. Thousands came to hear her speak. They called her Red Rosa now, and the name had weight. In Fechenheim, near Frankfurt, on a September evening, she stood before a crowd and said the words that would bring the state down on her head. If we are expected to lift the murder weapon against our French or other brothers, she told them, then we shout, we will not do it. The War Ministry treated this as incitement to mutiny. A trial was scheduled for February of the following year in the Frankfurt Criminal Chamber. Rosa would face the machinery of imperial justice, and she would not flinch. The prosecutor called her an international personality with no fatherland. He described her speech as an assassination attempt on the life nerve of our state and demanded immediate arrest. Rosa listened to this with something between amusement and contempt. In her defense, she mocked his literalism, his inability to grasp what she actually meant. She did not need to command soldiers to disobey, she explained. Socialist education would lead them naturally to reject fratricide. The masses would awaken on their own. Then she said something the courtroom would not forget. "I will fight as the mortal enemy of the existing social order until my last breath. 1 year in prison." The sentence sparked protests across Germany, and in Frankfurt alone 3 rallies were held the following day under the slogan "Denouncer and Justice." During those weeks, she grew close to her young lawyer, Paul Levi, 12 years her junior. Their professional relationship became something else entirely. She kept it hidden from Yogakis, who still watched her from a distance with jealous eyes. But before she could serve her sentence, the Prussian war minister launched a second attack. She had said that dramas of mistreatment play out daily in German barracks, and now she would answer for it in court. The charge was insulting the officer corps. It was meant to silence her. It did the opposite. Her defense team, led by Levi and Kurt Rosenfeld, organized a campaign to collect evidence. 922 former soldiers appeared in court to testify. Over 30,000 cases of mistreatment were documented. The courtroom flooded with witnesses ready to describe what they had seen and suffered. The prosecutor asked for an adjournment to investigate. Even the liberal press mocked the war ministry for putting militarism in the dock. Then came Sarajevo. On the 28th of June, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot dead. The international situation deteriorated with terrifying speed. Rosa traveled to Brussels for a meeting of the International Socialist Bureau, trying to unify the fractured Russian socialist groups, mediating between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. Lenin sent Ines Amand with instructions to obstruct any unity. He did not attend himself. She returned to Berlin on July 19th and was plunged into the frantic final days of peace. The SPD organized 32 protest meetings in Berlin alone. 100,000 workers demonstrated against the war, shouting "Down with the war," while police sabers flashed above the crowd. Rosa rushed back to Brussels for an emergency meeting on July 29th. Victor Adler confessed to the room. "We are powerless." Jean Jaurès, the great French orator, still believed in a diplomatic solution, perhaps a general strike. Rosa watched him speak at the peace rally, pale and silent. 2 days later, he was assassinated in Paris. She returned to Berlin on July 31st and sent a telegram to Kostya Zetkin, "Am deeply shaken." Just returned home, the German government had declared a state of threatening danger of war. The momentum for peace was collapsing. Despite the massive demonstrations, the SPD leadership was already negotiating secretly with the government, drifting toward the party truce that would betray everything Rosa had fought for. The courtroom victories and the mass rallies had given a false sense of strength. While she had been exposing the cruelty of the barracks, the SPD leadership was preparing to vote for the funds that would unleash that cruelty on a global scale. The international solidarity she preached was about to be shattered by a wave of nationalism that swept away even her closest comrades. On a suffocating day in August, the world she knew collapsed, leaving her not with a plan for revolution, but with a desire for death. Chapter 12. The Junius Pamphlet. August 4th, 1914, the day the world broke in two. In the Reichstag, the Social Democratic Party voted unanimously to approve war credits, sending German workers to die for the very empire they had sworn to destroy. That evening, Rosa lay on her sofa in Zuid-Ende, weeping. She told a friend she wanted to shoot a bullet through her own head as a final protest against the betrayal. The party she had given her life to had just handed that life over to the generals. But she did not reach for a gun. Instead, she reached for the telephone. By nightfall, a small group had gathered in her apartment. Franz Mehring was there, along with Julian Marchlewski and Wilhelm Pieck. They drafted 300 telegrams condemning the vote and sent them to party officials across Germany. It was a gesture, perhaps a futile one, but it was the seed of something that would grow in the dark. They called themselves the Gruppe Internationale. Later, they would become the Spartacus League. The collapse of the Socialist International was, to Rosa, complete and terrible. The German working class, which she had believed to be the vanguard of world revolution, was now wading in blood for imperialist aims. She had spent years warning of this moment. Now that it had arrived, she found herself almost paralyzed by grief. Before she could organize any effective resistance, the state reminded her of an old debt. Her pre-war prison sentence, handed down for that fiery speech in Frankfurt, had never been served. On February 18th, 1915, she walked through the gates of the Royal Women's Prison on Barnimstrasse. The cell door closed behind her. Outside, the cannons roared. Cut off from the world, Rosa did what she always did. She wrote, page by page. Smuggled out by her loyal friend Mathilde Jacob, she produced her most famous work. It was called The Crisis of Social Democracy, though history would remember it by its pen name, the Junius Pamphlet. The words burned with fury. She described capitalist society as shamed, dishonored, wading in blood, dripping with filth, a roaring beast, an orgy of anarchy, a pestilential breath upon culture and humanity. The pamphlet laid out the stakes with terrible clarity. There were only two paths forward, she argued, socialism or barbarism. If the war continued, civilization itself would be consumed. And yet, even in that bleak cell, Rosa found ways to stay sane. She started a new herbarium, pressing plants between the pages of notebooks with the same rigor she brought to political economy. By the end of her various imprisonments, she would fill 18 of them. On February 18th, 1916, exactly 1 year after she had entered, Rosa walked out of Barnimstrasse. A crowd of women waited at the gates, throwing flowers into her carriage. She smiled, waved, and immediately threw herself back into illegal work. The Spartacus letters were now appearing regularly, and she helped edit each one. The opposition was growing bolder. On May 1st, 1916, the Spartacists organized a daring demonstration on Potsdamer Platz. Karl Liebknecht, still wearing his army uniform, stood before the crowd and shouted, "Down with the war! Down with the government!" He was arrested on the spot. Rosa had been at his side during the protest. She slipped away, but she knew her time was short. She spent the next weeks mobilizing support for Liebknecht, who was sentenced to hard labor. Then, on July 10th, the military authorities came for her. There was no trial, no specific charge. They called it protective custody, a bureaucratic phrase that meant she was too dangerous to be free. She would not see the outside world again until the war was over. Chapter 13. Letters from the Garden. On October 26, 1916, Rosa arrived at the fortress prison in Ronke. It was a red brick complex in the Polish countryside, and unlike the dark police cells she had known before, this place offered something unexpected. She was classified as a protective custody prisoner rather than a criminal, which meant books, letters, and access to a small garden. She lived in a separate house that had once belonged to the prison administrator. 2 rooms. One became her cell bureau, lined with books and portraits of friends. The other held her bed and a window that looked out onto the yard. It was almost domestic, if you could forget the guards and the locked gates and the war grinding on beyond the walls. The garden changed everything. She spent hours there, watching the birds. Titmice and sparrows came to her window, and she learned to recognize them individually, their habits and preferences, the particular way one would tilt its head before taking a seed. She wrote to Sophie Liebknecht about these creatures as though they were old friends returning to visit. Her letters from Ronke became something remarkable. She described birdsong as the only thing in the world she could listen to with unadulterated pleasure. She fussed over her roses and lupins with the dedication of a professional gardener. She wrote about weather as though the sun and rain were her true companions in isolation, calling the light liquid gold, describing the grey days as leaden. The woman the right-wing press called Bloody Red Rosa spent her imprisonment cataloguing cloud formations and the feeding patterns of sparrows. But Ronke was temporary. In July 1917, she was transferred to the military prison in Breslau, and conditions there were different. The garden was a dusty courtyard. City noise pressed in constantly. The nearby military hospital added its own sounds to the din. Her health began to fail. Stomach troubles, frayed nerves, the accumulated weight of indefinite detention. She spent days in bed. But in her letters, she maintained a cheerful tone, hiding the extent of her suffering. She was protecting her friends from worry, even as her body broke down around her. It was from Breslau, in December 1917, that she wrote the letter that would become the most famous of all. She had witnessed a scene in the prison courtyard. Romanian water buffaloes, confiscated as war booty, were being whipped by a soldier because they could not pull a heavy load. The animals had been dragged across the continent to serve an empire that was already dying. She described one buffalo looking at her with an expression on its black face and in its soft black eyes like a weeping child. The heavy whip handle crashed down on the animal again and again. It pulled in its head and whimpered quietly. She stood there, a prisoner watching prisoners, separated by species but united in helplessness. The onlookers did nothing. She noted their indifference. The war, she wrote, had turned the world into a slaughterhouse. While her heart was with the buffaloes, her mind tracked the Russian Revolution. She obtained newspapers through a smuggling network involving her lawyer Paul Levi and her friend Mathilde Jacob, who carried laundry baskets filled with books and hidden manuscripts past the guards. She greeted the overthrow of the Tsar with euphoria, but as the Bolsheviks consolidated power, her enthusiasm curdled into concern. In the summer of 1918, she wrote a manuscript called The Russian Revolution. It would not be published until 1922, years after her death. In it, she offered a critique so sharp it would prove prophetic. Lenin and Trotsky, she argued, were suppressing democracy in ways that would lead not to socialism but to a dictatorship over the very people they claimed to serve. Freedom only for the supporters of the government, she wrote, only for the members of a party, however numerous they may be, is no freedom at all. freedom is always the freedom of the one who thinks differently. She warned that without general elections, without unrestricted freedom of press and assembly, without a free struggle of opinion, life dies out in every public institution, becomes a mere semblance of life, in which only the bureaucracy remains as the active element. She was writing from a prison cell, completely cut off from events. Yet she could see where the Soviet experiment was heading decades before others would admit it. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk disturbed her deeply. She saw it as a capitulation to German imperialism, a move that would strengthen the Kaiser and prolong the slaughter. She was right about that too. By autumn 1918, the atmosphere in the prison shifted. News of the German military collapse filtered through. The guards grew lax as the authority above them crumbled. Rosa watched the twilight of the empire from her cell window, seeing returning soldiers drift past like ghosts, sensing that the doors were about to open. She prepared for release without joy. Her hair had gone grey. She felt physically broken. But the German Revolution, the moment she had waited for all her life, was finally arriving. She could not remain a spectator. Chapter 14. The Revolution Comes. On the morning of November 9th, 1918, the gates of Breslau prison swung open. Rosa walked out into a Germany that no longer existed. The Kaiser had abdicated. The Republic had been proclaimed in Berlin just hours earlier. She was greeted by a handful of comrades who rushed her to the local party office, where she addressed a crowd from the balcony. Her voice was thin from years of confinement, but her spirit had not dimmed. She needed to get to Berlin. The trains were chaos. Revolutionary soldiers, deserters, workers with red armbands, families fleeing the cities. She finally arrived at the Anhalter Bahnhof on the evening of November 10th, stepping onto the platform into a city drunk with freedom and utterly confused about what to do with it. Karl Liebknecht met her there. He had been released in October and had become the most famous man in Germany, having proclaimed the Free Socialist Republic from the balcony of the city palace just hours before she arrived. Their reunion was emotional. Two old comrades, finally free, standing in the middle of a revolution they had dreamed about for decades. Rosa had no home to return to. Her apartment in Südende had been looted during her imprisonment and was uninhabitable. She lived out of a suitcase at the Hotel Excelsior near the station, then found a temporary room. There was no time to settle. On November 18th, the first issue of Die Rote Fahne appeared, The Red Flag. Rosa was its chief editor. The editorial office at Königgrätzer Straße became the nerve center of the radical left. She worked frantically, often sleeping on a sofa in the office, writing lead articles that tried to give direction to the chaotic movement swirling around her. She found herself in a minority position almost immediately. While the masses shouted for unity, Rosa and Liebknecht argued there could be no unity with the SPD leaders who now headed the provisional government. These were the men who had voted for war credits in 1914, the men who had supported the slaughter, traitors, in her view. The Christmas struggles of December 24th made things worse. Government troops fired on the Revolutionary People's Navy Division. Rosa became convinced the SPD government was actively counter-revolutionary, allied with the old military caste that had brought Germany to ruin. The decision was made to found a completely new party. The founding Congress of the Communist Party of Germany opened on December 30th in the festive ballroom of the Prussian Landtag. The atmosphere was feverish. Young radicals dominated the room, impatient for action, burning with revolutionary fervor. Rosa, the experienced theorist, found herself in the strange position of being the moderate voice trying to restrain them. She delivered the main program speech on December 31st. "The playful time of the first illusions is over," she warned the delegates. The revolution would be a long, hard road, a dash of cold water that many did not want to hear. The critical moment came with the vote on participation in the upcoming elections for the National Assembly. Rosa argued strongly for participation. The election campaign would be a way to educate the masses, to expose the government's compromises, but the majority of delegates, intoxicated by the revolutionary mood, voted against participation. 62 to 23. A boycott strategy that Rosa considered childish and suicidal. She was visibly shaken. During the break, she said to Leo Yogikis, "They are still babies. We have to wait until they grow up." But she knew history might not grant them the time to mature. Karl Radek arrived from Moscow, smuggled into Germany in disguise, the emissary from the Bolsheviks. His presence symbolized the link to the Russian Revolution, but Rosa remained wary of simply copying their model. Germany was different. The working class here was organized, educated, had decades of socialist tradition behind it. By the end of the Congress on January 1st, 1919, the KPD was born, but it was a party divided against itself. A leadership of seasoned intellectuals led by a woman who preached patience and a rank and file of angry young men who wanted to storm the heavens immediately. Rosa was physically a wreck. Friends described her as looking shrunken and old, her clothes hanging loosely on her frame, sustained only by nervous energy and copious amounts of strong coffee. She knew the situation was precarious. The counter-revolution was organizing in the form of the Freikorps, volunteer militias filled with bitter veterans who blamed the socialists for Germany's defeat. The government was printing posters that openly incited violence against the Spartacus leaders. "Kill Liebknecht," they read. As the new year dawned, Rosa stood at the head of a movement rushing toward an explosion she feared she could not control. She wrote to a friend that she was living on a volcano. The volcano erupted sooner than anyone expected. In the first days of January, a provocation by the government triggered an explosion of rage in the Berlin working class. The Spartacus week began with a spontaneous surge of hundreds of thousands into the streets. Rosa knew it was too early, that it was a trap, but she could not abandon the workers. She made the fatal decision to stand by the uprising she had not ordered. As Freikorps troops marched into Berlin with flamethrowers and machine guns, the hunt for Red Rosa began in earnest. The net was closing. Chapter 15. The Final Days. The apartment at Mannheimer Strasse, 43, sat in the Wilmersdorf district, a bourgeois corner of Berlin where the buildings were respectable and the neighbors kept their curtains drawn. Rosa had been living there under the name Dr. Lynch. Karl Liebknecht went by Dr. Körner. For days they had moved between hiding places in Neukölln and Wilmersdorf, staying one step ahead of the government's bloodhounds, who had placed a bounty of 100,000 marks on their heads, dead or alive. The atmosphere inside was tense, but strangely intellectual. Rosa spent her final hours reading Goethe's Faust, turning the pages with the same discipline she had brought to everything. Her stomach pained her. Her body was exhausted, but her mind remained what it had always been. Around 9 o'clock in the evening, the doorbell rang. It was not a friend. A unit of the Wilmersdorf citizens' militia stood in the hallway, led by a second lieutenant named Lindner, acting on a tip from a local resident who had recognized the famous agitators. The arrest was chaotic. Militiamen stormed through the door, heavily armed and running on adrenaline. Rosa sat at a table. She asked, with a calmness that unnerved them, whether they had a warrant. They had no reply but force. She began to pack a small suitcase. She folded her few belongings meticulously, including the volume of Faust and a copy of the journal Die Neue Zeit. The gesture was almost meditative, as if she already understood that her political race was run. They were not taken to a police station, as the law required. Instead, the car drove them to the Hotel Eden, at the corner of Kurfürstendamm and Nürnberger Straße. The hotel had been commandeered as headquarters for the Guard Cavalry Schützen Division, a Freikorps unit loyal to the old imperial military hierarchy. The arrival was a descent into something uglier than law. The lobby was filled with officers and soldiers and civilians drinking beer and champagne, celebrating the crushing of the uprising. The air hung thick with smoke and bloodlust. When the crowd saw the prisoners, they erupted. Jeers, insults, shouts of "kill them and here comes the Jewish sow." Guests stood on chairs to get a better look at the Red Terror in the flesh. They were taken to the first floor for interrogation by Captain Voldemar Pabst, the ruthless General Staff officer who was effectively running the counter-revolution in Berlin. Decades later, in the 1960s, Pabst would admit that he had decided then and there that they would not leave the hotel alive. The interrogation was brief. When Pabst asked Rosa for her identity, she replied, "You know who I am." She refused to validate his authority with a direct answer. The whole thing was a sham, a formality to buy time, while the execution squad assembled outside. Karl Liebknecht was taken first. Around 10:45, he was led out a side exit. As he stepped onto the street, a soldier struck him from behind with a rifle butt. He was dragged into a waiting car. The car drove him to the Tiergarten, near the Neue See. It stopped, supposedly due to a breakdown. Liebknecht was ordered to walk. As he stepped into the darkness of the park, he was shot in the back of the head. The official report would later claim he was shot while trying to escape. Back at the hotel, Rosa was prepared for her end. Around 11 o'clock, she was led down the main staircase. The lobby had become a gauntlet of hate. Officers and elegant women spat at her and shouted, "The old slut is leaving." Waiting in the shadows near the revolving door was a rifleman named Otto Runge, a brutish soldier who had been promised a bribe to do his duty when the Jewish pig came out. As Rosa stepped through the hotel entrance into the cold night air, Runge swung his rifle butt with tremendous force. The heavy wooden stock crashed into her left temple and jaw. There was no scream. The blow was so sudden and devastating that she collapsed silently to the pavement. Her hat rolled away into the gutter. Her shoe slipped from her foot. As she lay on the ground, stunned, or perhaps already unconscious, Runge struck her a second time, smashing the rifle butt into the top of her skull. Soldiers grabbed her limp body and dragged her into the waiting car. She was thrown onto the back seat between two officers. As the car sped away down Nürnberger Straße, the violence continued inside. Witnesses later testified that one of the officers struck her again on the head with the butt of his pistol. The car did not head for the Moa Beat prison. It turned toward the Tiergarten, but the officers decided that repeating the Liebknecht method was too risky. Lieutenant Hermann Souchon drew his pistol. He leaned in, placed the muzzle against Rosa's left temple, the side already smashed by Rung, and pulled the trigger. The car reached the Landwehr Canal near the Liechtenstein Bridge, a quiet, dark spot between the Tiergarten and the zoo. It was a freezing night. The canal was covered in a thin layer of ice. The officers lifted her small, blood-soaked body from the car. There was no ceremony, no final words. They swung her over the railing and threw her into the black water. The body broke through the thin ice and sank immediately into the depths. One of the officers reportedly remarked, "The old sow is swimming now," as they dusted off their hands and climbed back into the car. They drove back to the Hotel Eden to report the successful completion of the mission to Captain Pabst. The mood was celebratory. Beer and sandwiches were served to the murderers as if they had just returned from a successful hunt. Almost immediately, the cover-up began. Pabst issued an official communiqué stating that Liebknecht had been shot while fleeing and that Rosa Luxemburg had been dragged from the car by an angry crowd of unknown civilians and whisked away to an unknown location. The cynicism was absolute. The next day, the press reported the lynching of Rosa Luxemburg, playing into the narrative that honest German people had taken justice into their own hands against the traitor. In reality, her body drifted in the canal, snagged on debris, hidden by the ice. A single shoe, lost during the assault at the hotel door, was retrieved by a hotel staff member and kept as a macabre souvenir, the only physical trace left of her on the night she vanished. The water had closed over her head, and the officers at the Hotel Eden raised their glasses, believing they had solved the Luxemburg problem forever. They thought that by erasing the body, they could erase the idea, but a corpse is a stubborn thing, and a martyr is even more dangerous. While the murderers were being slapped on the back and given fake passports to flee the country, a different kind of search was beginning. A heartbroken lover was sending divers into the murky water, determined to prove that this was not a lynching but a state-sponsored execution. The body would eventually rise, but the ghost of Rosa Luxemburg was about to become immortal. Epilogue: The Eagle and the Afterlife. The hunt for Leo Yogicus did not take long. On March 10th, 1919, he was arrested and dragged to Moabit prison. A few days later, a police sergeant named Tamschik shot him in the back of the head. The official report claimed he was trying to escape, the same lie they had used for Rosa. For nearly 5 months, the Landwehr Canal kept its secret. Then, on the last day of May, a swollen body surfaced near the Freiaschenbrücke. It was unrecognizable. They identified her only by the shreds of her velvet dress and a small gold locket she had always worn around her neck. Her funeral, on June 13th, became something the government had not anticipated. Tens of thousands of workers walked in silence through the streets of Berlin toward Friedrichsfelde Cemetery. A sea of red flags stretched for miles. The Freikorps had killed the woman, and somehow, in doing so, they had made her immortal. The trial that followed was a bitter joke. The court-martial in May acquitted most of the perpetrators. Lieutenant Vogel, the man who likely threw her body into the canal, received a slap on the wrist before being whisked away to the Netherlands with a passport provided by the very authorities who should have prosecuted him. Waldemar Pabst, the officer who gave the execution order, lived a long and comfortable life. He became an arms dealer. In the 1960s, he boasted openly about what he had done. "I had them executed," he said. He claimed he had the tacit blessing of Gustav Noske and the Social Democratic leadership. He said he was saving the fatherland. In the years after her death, two competing legends took root. The right wing painted her as a bloodthirsty fury, a foreign agitator who had tried to destroy Germany. The communist movement elevated her to sainthood, printing her face on pamphlets and naming their meeting halls after her. Yet even those who worshipped her began to view her actual writings with a certain nervousness. Vladimir Lenin, who had fought bitter theoretical battles with her while she lived, defended her memory in 1922. He quoted an old Russian fable, "Eagles may at times fly lower than hens," he said. "But hens can never rise to the height of eagles," a backhanded compliment that acknowledged her brilliance while carefully noting her mistakes. Under Stalin, those mistakes became unforgivable crimes. In 1931, he published a tract that essentially excommunicated everything she had stood for. Luxemburgism was now a heresy, lumped together with Menshevism and Trotskyism. The German Communist Party, the very party she had founded, joined in the denunciation. Ruth Fischer, one of the new Moscow loyal leaders, called Rosa's theories the syphilis of the German working class. A strange and terrible fate for a founder to be disowned by her own children. The Nazis finished the erasure. Her grave at Friedrichsfelde was razed by the Gestapo. Her bones were likely stolen or simply lost. Her books burned on the pyres of May 1933. A forensic mystery resurfaced in 2009 when a headless corpse was found in the basement of the Charité hospital. Some believed it was her. The question was never definitively settled. After the war, East Germany built a new cult around her memory. Her face appeared on postage stamps and banknotes. The annual Liebknecht-Luxemburg demonstration became a state ritual, a carefully managed display of loyalty. Yet the state that claimed her as its martyr also censored her most dangerous ideas. Her critiques of the Bolsheviks were quietly suppressed. That famous sentence about freedom belonging to the one who thinks differently was notably absent from the official textbooks, tucked away where it could cause no trouble. The irony of this silence exploded in January 1988. East German dissidents joined the official parade and unfurled banners bearing her own words. The secret police arrested them immediately. The state that had claimed to be her heir proved in that moment that Rosa Luxemburg remained dangerous, even from the grave, even to those who professed to love her. In the West, the student movements of 1968 rediscovered her. They carried her posters through the streets of Berlin and Paris and Berkeley. They saw in her a socialism that was democratic, spontaneous, human, something utterly different from the grey bureaucracy they associated with Moscow. Her prison letters, published widely in the post-war years, transformed her image. The woman who wept over mistreated buffaloes and fed crumbs to titmice on her windowsill emerged alongside the fiery orator, and readers fell in love with both. Today, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation operates across the globe, keeping her name alive in struggles for justice and democracy and feminism. Her prophecy, it seems, has been fulfilled. She has returned, clashing amidst the trumpets. Perhaps the final verdict on her life comes from her own pen. In the Junius pamphlet, written from a prison cell while Europe tore itself apart, she posed a choice that still echoes into our century. Bourgeois society stands at the crossroads, she wrote. Either transition to socialism or regression into barbarism. The crossroads remain, and the question she asked is still waiting for an answer. We have traveled from the small town of Zamość to the heart of world revolution, and finally to the contested memory of a woman who belongs to no single nation. She is there in the prison garden, finding beauty in the smallest things. She is there on the platform, her voice carrying over the heads of men who underestimated her. She is there in the canal, in the red flags, in the words she left behind. I was, I am, I shall be.